Okay, Misfortune is known for her strong ultimates. All there is to this champion is just waiting for a teamfight to start, and while other ADCs have to kite with autos and run in circles to not get caught, Misfortune simply sits there and presses R. Boom, fight won, easy. Or so many people believe. Because if it were that easy, then why isn't every single Misfortune main on the planet rising to Challenger? The truth of the matter is that playing Misfortune is just as skill-intensive as any other champion, but you have to express your skills in different ways. And in order to illustrate that, we will have a close look at how pro players are playing this champion at the highest level. Keep in mind, Challenger tier players also have Challenger tier opponents, and if your opponents are literally the best of the best, they're not just going to sit there and let you kill them with Misfortune's ultimates. So, what are the pro players doing differently that enables them to quite literally beat anyone they face with such a seemingly simple champion? In order to answer this question, I will show you the Misfortune rune and item setups used most frequently by pro players when they are trying to win in solo queue, but we are also looking closely at an in-game example. During that analysis part, you will see the pro player Jizu and how he plays Misfortune in his 1000+ LP Challenger solo queue games, and hopefully we can learn a thing or two there. However, keep in mind that the best way to learn and get better is not to practice by yourself, but to work with a highly skilled teacher. And this is where my sponsors from Solo Queue Solution come into play. Solo Queue Solution will set you up with a Challenger coach who works with you in hand-tailored one-on-one coaching sessions. They also have coaches for all 5 roles, so no matter what you main, they got you covered. The problem with League of Legends is that it is an extremely complicated game, so at a certain point you might not even be aware of what you are doing wrong. The result is that you are hard stuck in your rank and cannot climb anymore, no matter how hard you try. But this is the brilliance of one-on-one coaching. Your coach can analyze whatever it is that keeps you from climbing and give you individualized exercises, allowing you to unstuck and climb to Diamond and maybe even beyond. However, this coaching program is of course not for everyone. For a casual player, it doesn't make sense, truth be told. But if League of Legends is your main hobby, you play at least 15 hours of solo queue per week, and you really care about improving, you can book your first coaching session right away clicking the link in the description. Anyway, the rune page pro players are using might surprise you. As I've just said, good opponents are not just going to sit there and face tank your ultimate, yet still, the most common and successful rune page at the highest level is still entirely centered around amplifying this spell. Pro players go for First Strike, Magical Footwear, Biscuit Delivery and Cosmic Insight, with absolute focus in Gathering Storm's secondary. This is your typical Misfortune Pop Stomper rune page. You just want to sit there, press R and get all the damage through. At least that's what it looks like when you look at First Strike. First Strike amplifies your damage by a lot and for a 3-second window, which is perfect because Misfortune's ultimate is also a 3 seconds duration. Easy combo. Additionally, when you go for an ult-centered playstyle, you also want lethality items because they increase your ult's power by the most essentially, and First Strike is very synergistic with lethality at an inherent level. Lethality is inherently strong with gold generation because lethality is more valuable early levels, because early levels means less base armor, so the gold acceleration from First Strike feeds into that perfectly. The faster you get your next lethality item the better, the more heavily you will be able to snowball, and snowballing is all this build is about. The next rune, Magical Footwear, also feeds into that because not needing to spend 300 gold on boots means you get your next serrated dirk 300 gold faster. Again, the faster you get them the better. Biscuit Delivery is the only mana generating rune on this page, but it's really all you need, ever since blue buff in the late game is global. In the early game, Biscuits will help you to cast your spells even if you fight a lot, and in the late game, again, blue buff just takes care of it. Now, Cosmic Insight is a general good stuff rune. It does a lot for you. Summoner spell cooldowns are important, but also the item cooldowns means you have more uptime on your trinket, and also the active and passive effects of the items you might buy will be lower, or the cooldown will be lower, so you will have more access to them. And since this page is all about burst damage, you also need sufficient attack damage to make all the lethality worth it, because armor penetration when there's no damage behind it doesn't make sense really. So Absolute Focus and Gathering Storm, most easy inclusions ever. Misfortune, one of the highest AD ratios in the entire game. I think her ultimate is actually the spell with the highest ratio ever. And Misfortune's need of attack damage is even greater than for most other champions in her situation, because she has very low base AD just to, well, compensate for a high scaling. Anyway, most of you know what this rune page does, so let's have a look at the item build. And yes, funnily enough, pro players are not just going for this rune page, but also fully committing in their items with full lethality. At first it seems paradoxical, because once more, the enemy is just not gonna sit there and tank the ultimate. Yet still, pros are going to make it work, as you will see. And the build? Well, a core build is difficult to pin down, and the only real core is Doran's Blade plus Ghost Blade plus Boots of Swiftness, and the other items are situational. However, pro players really love Ghost Blade because it's so cheap, 2,700 gold, good combat stats, and also movement speed. A heavy emphasis on movement speed on this Misfortune build, on Misfortune's playstyle in general here, because you want to rotate, you want to be in every single fight you can. Additionally, movement speed is your best line of defense, also as you're going to see in the analysis, so staying mobile is very important if you don't want to die all the time. The rest of the build is full lethality, and since lethality items have also always a utility component to them, they're quite matchup dependent. It really depends on which opponents you're facing, what items you need ultimately. Yet still, I will give you an example build here. This is the build Jesus is using during the analysis part. The first item is Ghost Blade, then Boots of Swiftness, then Opportunity, and for the late game, Collector, Hubris, and Edge of Night in this order. Again, all in on the lethality plan. Some pro players are going for more crit in the late game, but the true late game doesn't really matter because you'll only get there if you're able to snowball with lethality in the first place. And here the heavy emphasis on movement speed gets even more amplified by Opportunity, another great item on Misfortune, very cheap, lots of damage, everything she needs really. The next full item, Collector, also perfect for snowballing, but very interestingly enough we see a late game Hubris after Collector. It might look odd because you want to collect Hubris stacks for it to be worth it, but if you're snowballing into the mid and late game, you can afford this in the late game as well. Even if it doesn't have stacks outright, it's still a lot of combat stats, and just with 0 stacks, just per takedown, if you just get the 10 AD, you can still use this to great effect in teamfights. However, a personal opinion from me, I don't really like Hubris late game, but it is possible. Last item, Edge of Night, is very similar to what we see from other AD carries. You might know that most AD carries want a Guardian Angel here, and Edge of Night also fills that niche, being a semi-defensive item that still provides offensive power. But there is a caveat: do not copy this build blindly for all of your games. You have to adapt, and most importantly, this will be super important for most of your games, you need Serylda's Grudge. I personally advocate for Serylda's Grudge rather early, third item or maybe even second item sometimes, latest fourth, but it's so important to get percent armor penetration because else tanks will ruin your day. And even against non-tanks, Serylda's Grudge is the biggest damage increase you can get. It's still a lethality item itself. And even though this example build doesn't have Serylda's Grudge in it, Jesus also buys Serylda's Grudge in many of his games. We just have this one in the example game we're about to analyze. In any case, an ult-centered rune page and an ult-centered item build. Do we also have an ult-centered playstyle, and how does that work against highly skilled opponents? Well, let's find out right now. The first thing I want to draw attention to is Jesus' lane phase. I always advocate starting with W on MF level 1, since you need it for duels and crucially for pushing for level 2 advantage. Jesus, however, takes Q and uses it very efficiently for poke damage and lane pressure. He is undoubtedly very good with these Q bounces, but unsurprisingly enough, without W he is unable to contest that ever-important level 2 power spike. However, he essentially traded level 2 advantage for an HP advantage, which will be very important going forward. Also, the enemy won't get much mileage here, since Jesus simply returns to his tower until he can reach level 2 himself. And his perfect use of Misfortune's hit and run trading pattern, dealing damage without getting hit in return, ultimately leads to situations like this. The fact that Kai'Sa had been poked so low already enabled Maokai to get a clean flash engage, and HP being the most coveted resource here, Kai'Sa of course has no chance to win. Yes, this extreme early aggression allows the enemy to kill Misfortune as well, but Jesus knows that this is still always favorable for a lethality user due to the item's snowball potential. The play was 100% worth it, and leaning into this is important. And this is the playing pattern you will see from Misfortune pros over and over again. Even when they are not creating situations themselves, but being almost recklessly aggressive, they still show that very same aggression when it comes to nearby fights. They will take every single play possible, even if that means being in a 1v3, and even if that means missing out on some farm, for example. As long as they can trade kills, it will allow them to snowball with lethality. Going down yourself in such fights doesn't mean much when the component items you can buy are just so much stronger than what the enemy can get. The power difference between a serrated dirk and the components of items like Static Shiv or Eclipse is night and day. Add MissFortune's safe, front-loaded damage on top of this, and the enemy has very little counterplay to all the pressure you can apply. This is actually very difficult for the enemy to respond to, since it is so easy for them to find themselves in lose-lose situations. After Rell had been pressured out of lane, Kai'Sa had a decision to make. Does she think she can survive a tower dive, or does she have to readily forfeit all the CS under tower? A very tough call to make for the enemy bot lane, and most of the time you provoke the tilted, emotional response here. But even had Kai'Sa backed off, she still would have been at an ever-growing disadvantage by losing so many minions. And what Zhu is doing in the early game is not at all difficult on a technical or micro-play level. All he does is move into max attack range, press Q and auto, and then moves away again until his Q is back up. Just rinse and repeat, it is the easiest way of dealing maximum damage while still maintaining safe positioning. But the key here is that you must press the issue right from the start. Always look for fights, and when there aren't any, make fights more attractive with your poke damage, as we've seen during level 1. And this is the way to play the early game, however only when there is at least one teammate near you who can actually start a fight and enable your damage. In this situation here, Zhu is completely alone, but look what he does. Did you spot it? It is a small detail, but very crucial. Being alone, safety is infinitely more important than dealing damage. The enemy wants to set up a tower dive here, but Zhu deliberately takes minion aggro, as you can see, holding the minions outside tower as a result and making it impossible for Rell to approach. 99% of all players, I reckon, would not have done this and would have died as a consequence. Okay, but now that MissFortune is level 6, we must ask ourselves the question, is this champion really just about standing still and pressing R? Well, yes and no. Please have a look so you see what I mean. As we can see, Zhu is using MissFortune's ultimate not to clean up a fight, but instead to provoke a reaction. He cancels his ult almost immediately, as all he needed was Rell to commit her cooldowns. And after these are forced out, he can safely re-enter with auto attacks. Yes, MissFortune's ultimate is a crucial tool, but no, it is not as one-dimensional as many people like to believe. Okay, now entering the mid-game, Zhu's priority is to remain grouped. Remember, MissFortune is quite vulnerable when isolated, but can deal lots of damage when supported by her allies' crowd control. And, sorry for stating the obvious, but allied crowd control actually is what turns MissFortune's ultimate into the brain-dead cleanup tool we all know and love. No enemy locked in place can survive this massive spell. Anyway, during teamfights you always have to be careful when to ult. Ulting routes you to the spot unless you're willing to cancel it, and movement speed is your primary line of defense when playing Lethality MissFortune. Staying mobile is important, as we can see here. And this is where playing Lethality MissFortune is all of a sudden no longer that easy. Had Zhu failed to dodge the Rell engage or any of the Katarina daggers, he would have just died in this fight with minimal impact. Kiting is a crucial skill even if you're going for such an ability-based playstyle. Standing still and pressing R is very rarely what you have to do, especially against good opponents. They will not just sit there and take it, which means you will have to rely more on the burst damage from your Q and your passive overall, because they are impossible to dodge. Simply standing there and pressing R for a pentakill is a power fantasy that will almost never be fulfilled. But realistically, all you need is to sneak in a few waves of your ultimate during a team fight to swing it in your team's favor. I won't deny that looking for good ults is important, but you should also never forget how strong your Q and your passive are in the late game. They both still have a 100% AD ratio, while also allowing you to stay mobile for defensive purposes. As you can see, while Miss Fortune is not mechanically demanding, she requires good decision making first and foremost. So if you want to see a demonstration of how I make decisions while playing this champion step by step, you can watch a fully commentated live gameplay video by clicking the link on your screen right there.